Well, please be seated. And please do take out your Bibles and turn to the passage that Phil read to us, Luke 23, verses 33 through 39. And again, encourage you to pull out your message outline as well. You find it helpful. Encourage you to take notes as we follow through what is a well-known passage, but I hope that we'll be able to learn something fresh from it, something to encourage us, and in many ways, I think, thrill our hearts. Now, I really ought to explain, I guess, regarding the title of the message this evening. No doubt, perhaps, when you did look at that in the bulletin today, you saw Jesus the joke. I hope you were stunned by that, because you should have been, because it's a shocking idea, isn't it? It's an irreverent thought. In fact, it is on the surface cruel and could be considered blasphemous to think of Jesus as a joke, especially at Calvary. And I'm sure you've never thought of it as such. Because when you think of Calvary, you perhaps think of its horrors, you think of its cruelties, you think of the agonies. You do not think it as a joke, and nor should you actually. I don't think of it as a joke, but the people who participated in it when it happened turned it into a joke. See, for them, Calvary was a big joke. From the viewpoint of the crucifiers of Jesus, the whole event had been twisted into a perverted and extended joke, and Jesus was the butt of that joke. What was the joke? This is the King of the Jews. Now remember, as we've been seeing over the last few weeks, remember that Jesus had already been stripped of his freedom when he was arrested. He was stripped of his rights when he was unjustly condemned. He was stripped of his friends when they all abandoned him. He was stripped of his ministry. Physically, he'd been stripped of his clothing down to a loincloth, but that was not enough for the people that crucified him. They were about to strip him of his life. But in the process, they wanted to make sure they stripped him of any respect that he might still have. And the execution of Jesus, you see, is designed to be one big joke. This is a king. Now, Luke says very few words about the crucifixion, but he says, you notice, many words about the attitude of the people who were there. There was scorn and mockery and sarcasm, all at this laughable King of the Jews. Now, obviously, from God's viewpoint, what the crucifiers thought was so ridiculous and funny was deadly serious. It just shows how wrong these people were, doesn't it? How far from reality can they get? Verse 35, 39, the people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. They said, he saved others. Let him save himself if he is the Christ of God, the chosen one. The soldiers also came up and mocked him. They offered him wine vinegar and said, if you are the King of the Jews, save yourself. There was a written notice above him which read, this is the King of the Jews. And one of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. Aren't you the Christ? Save yourself and us. And there you'll notice three verbal actions. They're described for us here: sneering, mocking, and hurling abuse. And they define for us the attitude of the crowd, both the Jews and the Romans, all of them throwing scorn at Jesus. All intended at sarcasm, at this laughable claim that was placed above his head. This is the King of the Jews. It was actually more than just their taunts. They had staged this very carefully. They had enthroned Jesus like a king is enthroned above the people, but only on a cross. They had placed on his head a crown, remember? Not a gold crown, but a crown of thorns digging into his forehead, sending blood streaming down his face. And in their diabolical joke, they had also crucified one thief on the right and one on the left. And they did that because they wanted to parody a king who has on his right and on his left two leading courtiers. That's what they would have. That's what they would do. The second and third most highest honourable people in his court. And so what they do to mock Jesus is they put two criminals, one on each side of this so-called king, as if they were his most respected courtiers. And then they offer him mock royal wine, you notice, as if doing their duty to serve the need of the so-called monarch. And it didn't just start there, remember. He had been wearing a crown of thorns for a while, because earlier on, remember, when he was in Pilate's judgment hall, they had put a mock royal robe on him. And they'd put a scepter in his hand, a reed, and then they hailed him as a king. And then they'd taken that reed and they beat him in the head with it, and they spat on him to show their disdain for the notion that this was in fact a king. The whole joke really kind of started there, didn't it? And then it began to escalate. And notice that the Romans, they get involved because they turn it into a full-grown comedy, all under this title, "This is the King of the Jews." The Jews laughed at it. The cross to them, Paul says, remember, was a stumbling block. There was no way that their Messiah, the Son of God, could ever be crucified. It was a joke to think of Jesus as their king, their Messiah, a crucified man, crucified by their arch enemies, the pagan, idolatrous Romans. Really? And it was equally ludicrous for the Romans, who saw a crucified God as foolishness, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1. Impossible to believe this. He claimed to be a king. He had no army. He claimed to be a king. He conquered no one ever. What an absolute joke. And so they extend the joke into full parody. It was just one big laugh to them. And they were so cruel in their joke as to cast sarcastic insults in the face of a crucified Christ. But this was not the time for laughing, because remember last week, if you go back to verse 27, remember they are following Jesus on the road to the cross. This great multitude of people were following, and among them women who were mourning him. They were the official hired mourners, as we saw last week, who went to events like this. But Jesus turning to them in verse 28, he says, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, weep for yourselves and for your children." This isn't the time to laugh. This is in fact a time for weeping. And not weeping for me, by the way. I don't want your pity, Jesus says, but weeping for yourselves, because you have rejected me, and God therefore has rejected you. So given the brutal character of crucifixion to start with, it should have just been enough that Jesus was crucified without adding insult to injury and turning it into a joke and mocking him as he hung there in absolute agony. So I want to unpack this a little bit. I want us to look at what was going on around the cross. And there's three things I want us to look at this evening. And the first is this. I need to say this just so you get it. Crucifixion is no joke. It really isn't. It is no joke. Verse 33, when they came to the place called the Skull, there they crucified him along with the criminals, one on his right and the other on his left. Now you notice that the New Testament, the gospel writers are very restrained in how they describe the crucifixion of Jesus. In the Greek it's just 3 words. Here in English it is 4. There they crucified him. That's all it says in Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. There's no details at all about crucifixion. Not about the hammers, not about the nails, not about anything physical whatsoever. Just the words, there they crucified him. Now, the question therefore then is, well, why is there not a further explanation of what was involved? Well, very simply, because all the readers of the time of the New Testament was written, they knew very well what crucifixion was. Crucifixion was common. We're told that as many as 30,000 people were crucified in the land of Israel around the time of Christ. The Romans also crucified them in public places, along roads and on hills, so that everybody could see the results of rebellion against Rome. They were well aware of what crucifixion involved, so there was no need to describe it, and there's no need for the Bible writers to describe Jesus' actual crucifixion, because it would have been exactly the same that everybody else had gone through. Jesus was no different. That's why Luke tells us, there they crucified him along with the criminals. Whatever they did to them, they did to him. So the crucifixion of Jesus is not a solitary experience for him by any means. There were tens of thousands of people, if not hundreds of thousands, who were crucified in the ancient world until it was in fact finally outlawed in the 4th century AD. Let me give you a little history of crucifixion. I think hopefully it's helpful to know this sort of stuff. Crucifixion goes back to 500 BC. It seems to be invented by the Persians. Darius crucifies 3,000 Babylonians. That's the first time we read about crucifixion. Alexander the Great, in the Great Greek Empire, he crucifies 2,000 citizens in the city of Tyre in vengeance over the way that they treated him. And he puts them up on crosses along the shore for everyone around to see. Around 100 BC, Alexander Jannaeus crucified 800 Pharisees and made their wives and children actually watch them be crucified. And the Romans, when they came to power in 63 BC, they used crucifixion extensively, and they perfected it. They were good at crucifixions. In fact, in 70 AD, when the Romans conquered Israel and they destroyed the temple and they slaughtered the Jews, historians say that Titus used so many crosses to crucify the Jews, they ran out of wood. So crucifixion was very common. It didn't need an explanation, but the Jews couldn't comprehend that their Messiah would be crucified. He was one who was going to come as a conqueror, not one conquered. This is not their Messiah. He wouldn't die a common death like tens of thousands of low-life common criminals, because crucifixion was reserved only for them. Therefore, anyone who was crucified was treated with absolute contempt. It was reserved for the worst and the lowest. And so when they came to the cross, typically they came to the cross with scorn. And the idea was that Jesus claimed to be God's anointed king and Messiah was just laughable. It was bizarre. It was so ridiculous that they managed to turn the whole thing into this joke. For them, a man like Jesus claiming to be a king only demonstrated that he belonged to an asylum for the insane. However, he was king, and by the way, one person recognized it. Go down to verse 42. As one of the two thieves who was put on the cross next to Jesus, he was put in the position to be part of the joke. He said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Now, he did originally see it as a joke, but he came to the point where he could see that the joke, there was not a joke. He came through the joke to the truth. We'll look at that next week, in fact. Jesus looks to be the Prince of Fools. How wrong an assessment that is. And back to verse 33, when they came to the place called the Skull. Now, we don't know where that place is. Nothing in the New Testament says it was a hill. But traditionally, the Roman way to crucify people was to put them up on an elevated place so that everyone could see them. So they wanted to make their point. So traditionally, it has been considered that it was some kind of high ground, and it was called the Skull, perhaps because it had some kind of configuration that represented or resembled a skull. That's all we know. We do know it was called the Skull, Golgotha in Aramaic or Hebrew, Calvaria in Latin, or Calvary. Some have said it was called the Skull because skulls of all the people who were crucified were lying around. I'm not sure that's the case. I don't think the Jews would have a place where skulls were just left. But it's interesting that its name is associated with the gruesome reality of what went on there, death. So verse 33, there they crucified him, very restrained. They means the Roman soldiers, by the way. You can see that in Mark 15, 16 through to 24. It was the Roman soldiers who actually crucified Jesus. Now, before they crucified him, according to Matthew 27, 34, there they offered Jesus wine to drink, mixed with gall, but after tasting it, he refused to drink it. Now what was that? Well, as cruel as they were, there was a little bit of human sensitivity in them, so they gave to the person who will be crucified a mild sedative. Perhaps not coming close to sort of easing the agonies of crucifixion, but sedating them enough so they could get them nailed on the cross without a fight. Can you imagine being a criminal or whoever being nailed to the cross? You would perhaps fight and struggle against that, so they would sedate them a little bit. But after tasting it, Jesus was unwilling to drink it. Why? Well, because Jesus would be crucified with his full senses. He didn't need to be sedated to get him nailed there. He would put his hands and feet there willingly. As we sang, it was his choice. He chose to do that. But he wasn't crucified alone. So we read about two criminals, some think co-conspirators with Barabbas. Remember Barabbas? Because Barabbas, though he was a murderer, he was also an insurrectionist, and you don't lead an insurrection by yourself, because if you do, you don't get very much success, do you? So Barabbas had been released, as we saw, because it was a custom to release a prisoner at Passover, and they wanted Barabbas, remember. The leaders of Israel had basically sort of calmed the crowd and called out for Barabbas, and they had him and not Jesus. Perhaps these were two co-conspirators with Barabbas who were guilty of some elements of insurrection. They are referred in Scripture in a couple of ways, criminals, but they're also called robbers, so we can't be sure. But we do know that they must have done something awful to be crucified. Crucifixion was reserved for the most serious of crimes. But all three of them are crucified in the same way. Please note that, really important. Luke 23:33, there they crucified him along with the criminals. Sometimes we want to sort of isolate Jesus out of the scene, but we can't do that. We mustn't do that. Whatever Jesus experienced, they experienced too. All three of them are crucified in the exact same way as thousands of others before them and after them would be. And I know, when you read there they crucified him, you wish you knew more, don't you? I mean, I do. And I think we have a right to know more. Because they understood when they read this in its original, because they were experiencing the reality of crucifixion right on into the 4th century AD, as I said. So maybe let me just give you a little bit of a summary so that you understand what was going on here. But I do want you to keep in mind that what was going on here was being done to 3 people, not 1. And it had been done to thousands upon thousands of people before and would be after. Now, through the years, there has been a lot of study of the crucifixion of Christ from the historical, biblical, and even medical viewpoints. All of these studies include the fact that everyone who was crucified was beaten before crucifixion. We read about that in the Gospels about Jesus. This was always done. And what they would do is it would be braided leather thongs with bits of metal and sheep bone or some other kind of animal bone embedded in them. They were used to lash the victim from the bottom of the neck all the way down to the back of the knees. And at the time that Jesus was being lashed, his arms would have been extended up and tied to a pole. So he was in a sort of a slumped position, if you like. And 2 soldiers would lash him with alternating blows. Now, we don't know whether or not they followed the Jewish prescription of no more than 40 lashes. We don't know that. We don't know how many lashes they received. But all the results would be that the bone and the metal ripped into the flesh. There would be deep contusions, lacerations into the skin tissue, into the fabric of the muscles. So you would receive immense pain. There would be blood loss and shock would follow. All 3 received this. Maybe Jesus had some intensified agonies, because it said of Jesus that when they took him back into the judgment hall, after they'd lashed him, they put a robe on him. And it would be an old, crusty, old robe made of wool that would do nothing to help him. In fact, it would agitate and irritate his open wounds. And then they rammed a crown of thorns on his head. They hit him with a stick and they spat on him, and at some point they would have ripped the robe off of him, which would again agitate and rip open the wounds. There will be intense pain, blood loss, making the skin hypersensitive. Add to that the lack of sleep and the lack of food, the lack of water, and after all of that, then came crucifixion for all 3. Now, crucifixion, we must understand, was death with maximum agony. The victims carried the cross, perhaps a cross piece, across the back of their neck and their shoulders, and their arms were tied to it. Jesus received help because, as we saw, he wasn't moving fast enough, or there must have been some other reason. The Romans wanted to get him there. So, as we saw last week, Simon of Cyrene was asked to carry his cross, either a piece of the cross off the shoulders of Jesus and carried it for him, or Jesus was actually carrying his whole cross, and Simon sort of picked up the tail end of the cross that was banging along the cobblestones, because Luke says he carried it behind him. And arriving at the place of crucifixion, they will be offered that sedation, which Jesus, remember, refused. Then they will be thrown to the ground on their backs. The crosspiece would then be pulled under their shoulders, and their arms were nailed to the crosspiece. And the Romans used nails. Archaeologists have found the remains of crucified victims from the early stage of the 1st century, and the nails were tapered iron spikes, about 5 to 7 inches long, about a ½ inch diameter square. And you often see that we talk about hammering the nails into Jesus' hands. It would have been his wrists, actually, rather than the palms of his hands, so that they could carry the full weight of the slumping body. And so lying on his back on the ground, each of these 3 would be nailed to the crosspiece with these great square spikes driven through each wrist. The impaled victim was then lifted up, and the crosspiece was then attached to the horizontal, which was often called the stipes. And the feet were then nailed. The knees would be bent up with the then feet nailed. And the feet were nailed with one nail, one foot over the other, so that the victim could push up to breathe, to inhale and exhale, to pull up on the wounds to do the same. And whether pulling with the wrists or pushing with the feet, they would be pulling and pushing against the wounds. And by the way, the slumping condition and the bent knees were so severe that you couldn't breathe in that position. And so the soldiers could bring death about in minutes by simply breaking the legs of the criminals. And if they broke the legs of the victim, couldn't push up, he would die in minutes because he couldn't breathe. So to survive, the victim would push up and pull up on the wounds. And they could hang there for days. Insects would burrow into their wounds, into the eyes, the ears, the nose. Birds of prey would tear at the open wounds. No one survived crucifixion. And to confirm death in the hours or days when the Romans thought the person might be dead, the body was pierced with a lance, and it was pierced in precisely the exact spot in the heart where the flow of blood and water, as it's described in the Bible, would come out to indicate death. And by the way, all Roman soldiers were taught the precise place in human anatomy to put your lance. And if you were a Roman soldier, you were a trained killer. You knew how to kill. Each effort of the person on the cross to breathe would mean they had to pull up and push themselves up, which would then rub the open wounds up the coarse and rugged cross, and then back again, ripping and shredding the wounds further. The nails in the wrist would crush or sever the large sensory nerve, and when a nerve is damaged and the nerve is pierced, the bolts of pain are relentless. And the nails in the feet would most likely pierce the nerve there with the same result. So you have relentless nerve pain through your feet and through your hands. The weight of the body pulling against all these agonizing, torturous bolts of pain results in struggling to breathe. And if you don't get enough oxygen, what do you get? We get muscle cramps. So add to that dehydration, arrhythmia, heart failure. We cannot comprehend how painful all of it was. In fact, we have a word for it. It's the word excruciating. Do you know where that comes from? It's actually the most extreme word we use for pain, isn't it? When we experience real pain, we call it excruciating. Well, it comes from the Latin excrucio, which means out of the cross. And this is the experience of all three men. But for one of those, it was in fact his destiny. Let me show you, because there's a second thing we need to understand, is that the crucifixion was in fact foretold. Now we have to get this, and I've put this in because we look at what's going on, but we now need to look, well, what's going on, why, the behind the scenes stuff. Now this is incredible and fascinating to me, because you see, the Jews should know this. The crucifixion of Jesus proved he is the Messiah. They should know that. They should have known that. Let me show you. You might want to turn up Psalm 22. It's a psalm of David. This is 1,000 years before crucifixion has been invented. Nobody has seen crucifixion, okay? It didn't exist until 500 years before Christ. Please keep that in your mind. This psalm, Psalm 22, this is 1,000 years before. So Psalm 22 looks at the cross of Christ. It is a prophecy. It's called a messianic psalm. Here's the beginning of Psalm 22, verse 1. My God, why have you forsaken me? Does that sound familiar anywhere? The very words of Jesus on the cross. Go down to verse 12. We read, many bulls surround me, strong bulls of Bashan encircle me. Now, what is all that? Well, Bashan was originally Amorite land, east of the Jordan and south of Mount Hermon, way up in the north of Israel. It was a beautiful, lush land. The snow on Mount Hermon sent down plenty of water into the north. So they were well-watered pasture lands, and consequently there were lands where cattle were raised. Great, strong bulls grew in the land of Bashan. So, this was a flourishing, fertile area. Now, once this was the territory of the Amorites, but given by God to Israel. So what does it do? Well, it represents for us here the powerful and strong. So therefore, it is a symbol of the Jews, the powerful, the flourishing, the well-fed, well-watered Jews, Israel. They surround me, they encircle me, verse 13, roaring lions tearing their prey open, their mouths wide against me. This is a prophecy of hatred, animosity, hostility, which is precisely what those well-fed and flourishing leaders of Israel were doing to Jesus as they surrounded him at the cross. And then David does here, he begins to describe something what crucifixion is. Even though no one has ever seen it, it hasn't been invented yet. Look at this, verses 14 and 16. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart has turned to wax, it has melted away within me. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You lay me in the dust of death. Dogs have surrounded me, a band of evil men have encircled me. They have pierced my hands and my feet. Wow. Well, it's wow for me. And then look at verses 17 and 18. I can count all my bones. People stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them and cast lots for my clothing. See, God was bringing to pass the fulfillment of a prophecy 1,000 years before. Now, 300 years later, 700 BC, along came another prophet by the name of Isaiah. And in Isaiah 53, we know it well, don't we? That great chapter in his prophecy, Isaiah describes the crucifixion before anyone has ever seen the crucifixion again. Isaiah says this, Isaiah 53 verse 5, but he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. And in the next verse he says, the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. So you have a Psalm 22, 1,000 years before, says that his hands and his feet will be pierced. The prophet Isaiah says that he will be pierced, not for his own transgressions, not for his own sins, no, because he was sinless, but for our transgressions. This is what sets Jesus apart from the other two criminals, doesn't it? They were pierced for their own transgressions. He was pierced for ours. See, it's not the physical sufferings of Jesus that are unique. It is the thing that he accomplished that was unique. And 150 years later, still long before the Jews have been exposed to crucifixion, along comes another prophet by the name of Zechariah. I'm sure God is just saying, just make sure you get this. It gives us all these prophecies. Zechariah, looking at the future, says this, Zechariah 12 verse 10, and I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and supplication. They will look on me, the one they have pierced. And they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and grieve bitterly for him as one grieves for a firstborn son. So while once they were laughing when they pierced him, in the future they will mourn when they look back on what they did. David and Isaiah predicting the piercing of Jesus 550 years before the cross. Zechariah predicts the piercing of Jesus and a time when the Jews will look back and realize what they did. They should have known this. They should have known the Messiah would be pierced, because that's the mark of his messiahship. And by the way, let me give you a future one. Listen to Revelation 1 verse 7. Look, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him. And all the peoples of the earth will mourn because of him. So shall it be. Amen. Who is even those who pierced him? Well, it's the Jews. Someday they're going to look on the one they pierced. And the thieves were pierced for their own transgressions. He was pierced for ours. The Old Testament foretold it. Remember, we've said this time and time again, Jesus is not a victim of circumstances. He's not in the wrong place at the wrong time. No. He fulfills prophecy, scripture, right to the very, very last jot of the pen. Amazing. Now let's come back to where we are. I just wanted to do a little bit of I was doing like an Apostle Paul, go digress, and now we come back. Let's look at thirdly, the crucifixion contrast. I'm not saying I am the Apostle Paul, because you're wondering now why, no way. But let's look, and there's contrast here, and then we're going to look at some of the people. I'll give you a bit more of the text. There is a stunning contrast at Calvary between the merciless insults of the crowd and the merciful intercession of Jesus. The crowd is made up of 4 groups, but they all have the same response to Jesus. They are heartless, cruel, and brutal. Let me show them. Let's look at, first of all, the people. The people. We see them in verse 35. The people stood watching. Now, it appears that they're in some kind of sort of stupor here, like watching some kind of blood sport. Just looking on and watching the joke play out. We might expect cruelty out of the Roman soldiers because they did this all their time. That was their job. They were executioners by trade who put him on the cross. So we might even expect cruelty out of the religious leaders as well because, well, they demonstrated how cruel they were. They wanted him dead. We might expect unsympathetic brutality from the criminals too because all compassion and sympathy has probably departed from their hearts anyway. They were criminals by profession. So we're not surprised at those people, but would we expect that maybe the crowd would be a little more sympathetic? These might be people in the crowd who had been healed by Jesus of diseases. They may have experienced some of Jesus' other miracles. Because remember, Jesus was in a very small area, his area of Judea and Jerusalem. There may have been people in the crowd who were fed. Remember the 5,000 that were fed? They may have been in that crowd. There were certainly people who knew those who had been healed. Wouldn't we expect to find them sympathetic? But even the crowd is cruel. You say, well, where are you getting that from? Because all it says is the people stood watching. Well, you have to look at one of the other Gospels, don't you? Matthew 27:39 tells us more. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross if you're the Son of God. Now remember, this crowd have been manipulated by the religious leaders. They are easily seduced by their own evil hearts as well, their hearts of unbelief. And they pour out venomous sarcasm on Jesus. They are vicious and cruel. But then there's also, secondly, the rulers. The rulers. Here we are, back to Luke 23:35. And the rulers even sneered at him. They said, he saved others, let him save himself if he is the Christ of God, the chosen one. And do you notice the words they are using? The terms they're using are messianic terms. The Christ of God, the anointed, the Messiah, the chosen one, they're all messianic titles taken from Daniel chapter 9. So they mock him for his claims to be the Messiah, the one chosen by God. They sneer at him. Now there's a really strong Greek word here. It's used only one other time in Luke, nowhere else in the New Testament. It's the word in the Greek for nose, is what it is. And what it means to push up your nose at him. Turn up your nose at him, that's the idea. In fact, it's a compound word, so you do it in a very extreme way. So what Luke wants us to understand here is that this is intense mockery and scorn. They blaspheme him. And notice they don't speak to Jesus. Do you see that? There's no record around the cross that they ever spoke to him. Who do they speak to? They speak to the crowd, don't they, about him. Hey, he saved others. Let him save himself if this is the Christ of God. He's meant to be the chosen one. Their intention is to stir up the crowd. Who did he ever save? From what? He delivered no one, because their view would be political, military deliverance, remember. Just total ridicule. And by the way, this is also prophesied in Psalm 22, verse 7. All who see me mock me, they hurl insults, shaking their heads. He trusts in the Lord, that the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. All that sarcasm was predicted in the psalm. They fulfill it to the letter, don't they? But there's a third group, and they are the soldiers. So we have the people, the crowd, we have the rulers, the religious leaders, we now have the soldiers. Here they are, verse 36, 37. The soldiers also came up and mocked him. They offered him wine vinegar and said, if you are the king of the Jews, save yourselves. Now, they don't know anything about Jewish theology. They just join in the game and they follow the same line. And in a mock act of service to him, as if he were a king, they offer him sour wine. Now, there are a couple of occasions at the cross where Jesus was offered something to drink. The first one, remember, was when they got him to the place to be crucified, as we've already seen, and they offered him a drink that had a sedative in it, and Jesus refused that. And then, when he comes to the very end of his dying, 6 hours later, when he's about to die, he says, "I'm thirsty." You remember that? John talks about that, I think. And they lift up a drink on a sponge on the end of a long stick. Now, this seems to be different from both of those occasions. This seems to be part of the game that they were playing. This is not giving him the wine in response to his asking. This does not appear to be the sedative because he's already there and the mockery is already in full scale. It's all going on. It seems that they offer him sour wine, saying at the same time, "If you're the king of the Jews, save yourself." And it's a pretend act, as if they were bringing royal wine to a king. That's the idea. So the mockery just reaches ultimate proportions. And verse 38 is very important. Note it in the text. There was a written notice above him which read, "This is the King of the Jews." And of course, that's the theme that sets the stage for the whole joke. Now, where did that sign come from? Well, John 19 tells us where it comes from. We know historically that when people were crucified, what they would do is that the crime, what they had done, was posted above them so that people knew why they were being crucified. It was another way to sort of shame them, really. And since Jesus committed no crime, they could not put a crime above his head. They couldn't put something up there. So Pilate decided what was going to go on the sign. John 19, verses 19 to 22. Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Many of the Jews read this sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the sign was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. The chief priests of the Jews protested to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but that this man claimed to be the King of the Jews." Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." And Pilate isn't going to change this. He wouldn't change it because this is Pilate's way to mock them. Remember they'd mocked him? Remember what they'd done to him? They'd backed him into a corner. They'd blackmailed him into executing a man who he knew was innocent. Even his wife said, "Wash your hands of this innocent man." Pilate said multiple times, "I find no fault in him." Pilate had been made to look a fool, so he wasn't going to leave it at that. Oh, no, no, no. So he wanted to turn the tables and make them look like fools. So this is Pilate's little joke at their expense. So you have the people mocking Jesus and Pilate mocking the people. It's all going on, isn't it? And something else about the soldiers, back in verse 34, "And they divided up his clothes by casting lots." Now that was standard procedure. The executioners were given the right to keep the final possessions of clothing of the people that were executed. That was sort of it's like a perk of the job, really. And remember, Jesus had been stripped of everything and all of his clothing, so he's naked except for a loincloth. And they're doing everything they can to strip him of all of his dignity. They want to make him such a mockery that he is there hanging naked. And now, fourthly, we had another group, which are the criminals. And we'll look at a bit more detail next week, but for tonight, look at verse 39. One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. "Aren't you the Christ? Save yourself and us." Now, they're all playing the same game. Now, only one is quoted in Luke, but Matthew and Mark tells us the rest of the story. Here's what Matthew says, Matthew 27:44, "In the same way the robbers who were crucified with him also heaped insults on him." Note that, that's both of them, that's plural. They both joined in, the whole crowd, all the rulers, all the soldiers, both the thieves. All Luke does is record for us what one of the two said, but they were both involved. It's just merciless, isn't it? Imagine you are hanging there in intense agony, and everybody around the cross at that moment is insulting you. I mean, we find it hard, don't we, when we're in a good place, when people perhaps have a go at us and insult us, and it affects us, doesn't it? Imagine what it would be like as the crucified Christ hangs there. But here comes the contrast. Because against all of these insults comes this glorious contrast, and that is the merciful intercession of Jesus. Because you see, it is stunning. Please do not miss this. It is starkly opposite, isn't it? Look at it, verse 34. "In the light of all that was going on, Jesus said, 'Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing.'" That's shocking, isn't it? In light of all the abuse and mockery Jesus is experiencing, we would expect Jesus to pour out furious condemnation on all of them, to judge them, to make them pay for their outrageous, extreme wickedness immediately on the spot. And he could do that. He is God. But he doesn't. He asks God to provide forgiveness for them. Now, Jesus spoke 7 things from the cross, but the first words he said were words asking divine forgiveness for the world's most wretched of sinners. Incredible. Now, to understand what he meant by this, it is first of all a general prayer for all the world to know that there is no sin against the Son of God that is so severe that cannot be forgiven if someone will repent. You know, you see some people and you think there's no way that person can be saved. Rubbish. Whoever repents will be saved. Because if there is forgiveness for these people, those who mock Christ, who were there when he was crucified, there is forgiveness for anyone. No one, but no one is so far away from God that they cannot be saved. So when he says, Father, forgive them, he knew who the them were, because on the day of Pentecost, 3,000 Jews in Jerusalem were converted to Christ and baptized, and the church began. Within a few more weeks, another 5,000, and more, and it moves to tens of thousands of people in Jerusalem who embraced Jesus Christ. Well, where did they all come from? Well, there must have been many of those who came to Christ in the weeks after the resurrection who were there in that crowd. So there was a general prayer telling the whole world that the sinner who repents and comes to Christ can be forgiven of the worst crime ever imagined, ever committed. But secondly, also is a specific prayer that God knows from before the foundation of the world who in that crowd he will forgive. A church was born out of these people who stood at the foot of Calvary and mocked the Son of God. And not only that, there was a soldier, remember the soldiers? There was a soldier among the soldiers. One of them came to salvation. We'll pick him up later. But when the centurion saw what happened, he began praising God and said, certainly this man is innocent. And Matthew says, he said, this is the Son of God. A hardened, trained Roman soldier who knows how to kill. He was one of the executioners. And yet he says, surely this was the Son of God. By the way, the religious leaders who wanted Jesus dead, some of them were also saying it. Do you want to show how much? Do you want to see how much God's grace is? How wonderful it is? Look at Acts 6:7. So the word of God spread. The number of disciples in Jerusalem increased rapidly. Notice that. And a large number of priests became obedient to the faith. Wow. That means some of the priests, some of the Sanhedrin were converted. Actually, I'll show you that later when we get to the burial of Jesus. And there was, of course, one of the 2 criminals who said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus answered him, I tell you the truth, today you'll be with me in paradise. And I'll tell you, we'll look at that next week. Now, in one sense, it's a general prayer that throws open the forgiveness of God for all who have rejected Christ, no matter how great their sin is. But at another level, this is a very specific prayer that was immediately answered among the crowd, among the soldiers, among the criminals, even among the priests. And the great irony of Calvary is that while all this scorn was being heaped on Christ, he was bearing the curse of God far worse than anything they could put on him. But in doing so, he provided the very atonement which makes the forgiveness he prayed for possible. And next week, we'll look at the criminal. And we'll look at how he got converted. And how God's grace was at work, even at that point. But that's next week. Let's pray. Why don't we take a moment and be quiet before the Lord? I realise there's been a lot perhaps for us to think through, to take in. And it might just be good that we quietly, personally, in our own hearts, thank God for giving us his Son. Of the great sacrifice that Christ went through. that atoning work upon the cross. But also recognizing that actually if we were there at the time, we would have been in that crowd crying for him to be crucified. We would have been there watching it take place. Because we know our hearts, we know how sinful we are, but we also know that we have been an answer to Jesus' prayer because he prayed for us that we may be forgiven. That as he dies on the cross, he prays not just for those there at the cross that God may forgive them, but he prayed for all in the future that they might be forgiven. So quietly, let's just thank the Lord for what he's done for us.